Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU and Dean Susan Gooden, welcome to the June installment of the Alumni Lunch and Learn series. Today's session is entitled Rising Costs, Rising Inflation, Making Sense of the Economy with our speakers, Katharine Bond and Paula Otto. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Wilder School hosts free virtual events monthly, like this one. Each session features change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on the relevant topics of the day. My name is Stephen Dozier, and I am the Director of Development and Alumni Engagement for the Wilder School. Before we get started, we are excited to announce that we have a rise in the rankings. According to U.S. News and World Report, the Wilder School is the #1 graduate program in public affairs in Virginia and is ranked top 15, in the top 15% among the nation. The school is number 35 in the nation among public affairs graduate schools, and our public management and leadership programs are ranked number 29 in 2022, according to the report's specialty programs rankings. We are proud to be at the forefront of our field. Featured here are graduate program application deadlines for fall 2022. Please feel free to contact Ross with any questions. His email address is on this slide and it will be provided in the chat. And if you haven't heard, our award-winning Master of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness and Master of Public Administration programs are available online. The application deadlines are provided here. Use the link on the slide or in the chat box to apply. Lastly, the spring 2022 edition of the Wilder School in Action magazine is available online. The link is in the chat. Now, on to our program. Paula Otto, Senior Director of Special Projects, is our moderator for this discussion, and she'll be introducing our speaker as well. Paula?
Thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome everyone. Our speaker today is Katharine Bond, who is Vice President for Public Policy and State Affairs at Dominion Energy. Katharine is responsible for overseeing local and state public policy issues for all states in which Dominion Energy conducts business. Katharine is a founding member of the Washington, D.C. branch of CHIEF, a network for women leaders, and also serves as a board member for Longwood University Board of Visitors, the Solar and Energy Storage Development Authority of Virginia, and the Clean Energy Advisory Council. Additionally, Katharine serves on the board of directors of the Virginia Chamber of Commerce and the Virginia Council on Economic Education, Lead Virginia, and Voices for Virginia's Children. Katharine holds a bachelor's degree from Longwood University in Business Administration and a master's degree from here at VCU in Finance. And we're very proud of the fact that she is currently a PhD student here at the Wilder School studying public policy and administration. We know we have hit on a very timely topic today. We have more than 60 participants who have tuned in this afternoon, and we've already received a large group of questions in advance. So Katharine, we know this is an important topic. We're looking forward to your insights, and I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Paula and Stephen, thank you so much. I just want to make sure you can hear me. Excellent.
Sound good.
Thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. As Eric, my colleague, is pulling up a presentation, I'll just remind folks that although I am employed at Dominion Energy, the presentation today, my thoughts here are mine. They're not necessarily endorsed by the company, but hopefully we'll provide some insight to you related to inflation and the economy, how it's affecting all of us and where we all might be headed. So with that, and before we dive too deeply into things, we'll cover the basics. Inflation is the general increase in the price of goods and services across the economy, or it can also be represented by a general decrease in the value of money. It's typically measured using a price index like the Consumer Price Index or CPI, but most people like you and me experience inflation through everyday shopping, like at the grocery store or when we fill up our gas tanks. As inflation occurs, individuals can purchase fewer goods and services with the same amount of money. So as a reference point, an individual would need about $326 today to have the same type of purchasing power someone in 1980 did with only $100. So we'll take a look at the Consumer Price Index, the measure of monthly changes in prices by US consumers to goods and services. It's the most popular measure of inflation. It's calculated by the US Bureau of Labor and Statistics. It uses about 94,000 price quotes and it's collected monthly. The data is collected from around 23,000 retail and service establishments, as well as 43,000 rental housing units. And according to the Bureau, the CPI climbed to 8.6% in May, meaning that the cost of all goods and services are 8.6 higher than they were just 12 months ago. This is the highest level that it's been at since around 1981. So keep in mind, that's also more than the lifetime of most college students today. So while it's monitored closely by policymakers, financial markets, businesses, and consumers, 8.6% doesn't necessarily exactly reflect what you and I are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So for example, have any of you tried to buy a car recently? As I'm sure you're aware, if you have, prices for used cars have skyrocketed over the last year, in some cases by more than 40%. And at the same time, automobile production in the country has reached an all-time low. Just a year and a half ago, it had just barely recovered. It's just barely recovered now to the same levels it was at roughly the end of the economic recession of 2009. So it's certainly far from what many of us would consider normal. And if you haven't had to purchase a car recently, if you do drive, you certainly have been affected by gas prices unless you drive an electric vehicle. So gas prices recently peaked nationwide up above $5 a gallon recently. It's about a $2 increase from the same time last year. Costs for electricity have also impacted consumers. And as someone who works for a utility, I know firsthand that means the cost to generate energy is becoming more expensive. It's not only fuel to run power plants that's more expensive, but also components to build things like solar generation. For example, in some portions of the solar industry, prices rose as much as 50% in 2020 due to supply chain and tariff issues. This reversed years of falling prices on solar. And maybe if you haven't bought a car, you've looked at a house or tried to purchase a house recently. Since the start of COVID, housing prices are up by more than 30%. That means if you bought a house in January of 2020 for $300,000, the same house might be worth almost as much as $400,000 today. And while these are some pretty dramatic examples of the rising costs of goods and services over the last year, it does beg the question, what the heck is going on? The inflationary pressure we're experiencing today is driven by many factors, some of which stem from the COVID-19 pandemic. However, there are a lot of additional factors that are contributing to inflation, such as the Russia-Ukraine war. However, if we want to boil it down to sort of its most simple explanation, it's really all about supply and demand. So we'll take a closer look at both. From a supply perspective, at the start of the pandemic, consumers and retailers started facing shortages across nearly all categories of goods and services, ranging from toilet paper to electronics. When governments began to shut down and quarantine workers and close shipping ports, the entire global supply chain was disrupted, and in some cases, and in some areas, brought to a complete standstill. This had a clear and direct impact on almost every sector in the United States, from manufacturing to construction to utilities and finance and insurance. For example, according to the US Census Bureau, most small businesses in the United States reported supply chain disruptions or delays due to COVID-19. Almost 60% of consumers report being unable to get a product due to shortages. And in a survey conducted recently by the National Association of Home Builders, a record share of home builders report shortages in key materials such as framing lumber, wallboard, roofing, and all of that's causing new construction to take a lot longer and even making it more expensive in most cases. Another way this can be seen is through the relationship of the end of month values and inventory to monthly sales. This ratio can be looked at as an indicator of the number of months of inventory that are on hand in relation to the sales for any given month. For example, a ratio of 1.5 would indicate that retail stores have enough merchandise on hand to cover 1.5 months worth of sales. And while we can see that the retail inventory is recovering from lows during the height of the pandemic, it still is near record lows. And if you're wondering why housing market prices are up, again, look at supply, which dipped near record lows in 2020. Another way to look at supply chain disruptions is through the RSM US Supply Chain Index. It produces a near real-time and forward-looking value at all the elements of transportation, manufacturing, sales, labor, and all those that underscore the manufacturing and service sectors. An index value of 0 defined as a normal level is defined as a normal level of supply chain efficiency. Positive values of the index suggest adequate levels, and negative values suggest deficiencies, which is where we find ourselves today. Based on the RSM US Supply Chain Index, supply chain bottlenecks are improving from record lows earlier this year, but still remain significantly underwater. So not only that, but demand for goods and services is at an all-time high. When the country shut down, millions of Americans lost their jobs. And at that time, policymakers and advocates, including economists, largely agreed that America needed immediate relief, and they acted on it. In March of 2020, lawmakers passed a $2.2 trillion stimulus package, followed by 2 more installments of COVID-19 relief later in 2020, and then again in 2021. And in late 2021, Congress passed and President Biden signed into law the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, shoring up another $1.2 trillion in funds for transportation, utilities, broadband, and more. But there's a catch. The economic stimulus efforts, along with the bullish stock market and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, greatly expanded money supply, creating record demand for products and services. The next chart we'll look at represents money supply. It is the money in deposit accounts, which has grown from 3.8 trillion in early 2020 to just over 20 trillion in early 2022, a substantial increase to say the least. That in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, of course, but with more money comes higher demand for products. And as I mentioned on the last slide, and if we think about supply and demand, more money chasing fewer goods can cause increases in costs. The next chart shows the producer price index for finished goods, which measures product demand before it reaches consumers. And as you can see, demand for finished goods has skyrocketed to levels not seen since the early 1980s. When there's higher demand for products, the law of supply and demand prevails and tells us that people will have to pay higher prices. During times of higher demand and when less product is available, there's a hidden form of inflation that's affecting every one of us who shops, particularly at grocery stores. Some people term it shrinkflation, which is the practice of reducing the size or quantity of a product while the price of the product remains the same, or in some cases even increases. It's pretty common in the food and beverage industry. Some examples include popular soda brands that used to be sold in 2-liter bottles, now come in bottles that are 1.75 liters. And boxes of tea bags that used to have 100 now have 88. But the news isn't all bad. I want to give a shout out to Costco here, although not an endorsement. But since 1985, Costco has had a $1.50 hot dog combo deal that's been a company staple. The company leadership says that customers can rely on the price and say it will stay the same despite inflation. So if they increase the cost of the $1.50 combo deal aligned with inflation, it would cost more than $4 today, but the company's chosen not to do so. So we'll shift gears and talk a little bit about ways that we might be able to relieve inflation. There are some levers that can help relieve inflation, so we'll touch on a couple of those. Again, the inflation that we're experiencing can be explained quite simply as too much money chasing too few goods, or with simple laws of supply and demand. If that's the case, relieving inflation means affecting one or both of those levers. Markets tend to correct themselves over time, but there are some levers, including interest rates, that can be utilized to speed along recovery. However, it can be a very, very delicate balance that comes with unintended consequences. Too much or too little intervention can trigger not just a recovery from inflation, but target a dip further into a recession. So with that, let's revisit the visual we looked at the beginning of the presentation, the consumer price index. Historically, when inflation has risen rapidly, typically caused by a triggering event, it's followed by an economic recession. You can see the peaks tend to be followed by valleys in this visual. So for example, the 1979 energy crisis, which was triggered by the Iranian Revolution and its aftermath, resulted in widespread panic about potential oil and gas shortages. In fact, oil prices nearly doubled before causing, in part, a global economic recession. We saw a mild recession following the 9/11 attacks. So I'm not saying that this can be used as a predictor of the future, but there certainly are interesting trends that we've seen historically. Unfortunately, governments really have very few ways, relatively speaking, to stop inflation altogether. And the ones they do have tend not to be very popular with voters. In recent years, the Federal Reserve would adjust interest rates to stimulate the economy during an economic recession. The idea being that by lowering interest rates, it's easier to access money and more of it will flow into the market. For example, the Feds lowered interest rates in 2008 several times to soften the impacts of the recession caused by the collapse of the housing market. However, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just a matter of too little money in the market, but in fact, too much money in the market and too few goods. So as a way to limit access to money, the Feds hiked interest rates just last week by 0.75 percentage point. That's on top of two smaller rate hikes earlier this year. And they announced the additional possibility of another rate hike later this summer. Other ways to limit money circulating in the economy might be to cut government spending, increase or taxes, which, as you probably all know, is not very popular with voters. So we'll talk a little bit about the elections in November in a few minutes and how that might have impacts. Interest rates are an example of how to either inject more money or correct the amount of money in the economy. So as for the supply side of the equation, certain workforce numbers are beginning to rebound. The labor force participation, or the share of potential workforce that is actually working or looking for work, dipped down to its lowest rate in more than 40 years during the pandemic. It's currently around 62%. Increasing labor participation can also relieve supply shortfalls. Supporters of the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act aim to put Americans back to work much the same way Roosevelt's New Deal helped bring America out of the Great Depression. Due to increased restrictions on immigration and travel, which began in the COVID-19 pandemic and in the early months of 2020, the net inflow of immigrants to the United States essentially halted for almost 2 years. By the end of 2021, in fact, there were about 2 million fewer working age immigrants living in the United States than there would have been in pre-2020, before the pandemic and before immigration trends, if they had continued unchanged. Of these lost immigrants, about 1 million of them would have been college educated, and the data on labor shortages across industries suggests that this drastic drop in foreign labor supply is likely a contributor to the current worker shortages many companies are experiencing. It could also slow down employment recovery and growth as the economy does pick up speed. Restrictions are easing, which could ultimately have a positive impact on supply. So just like with interest rates, there's a delicate balance here to be reached with respect to numbers of workers in the job market. If low unemployment shifts to high unemployment, it can be an indicator of recession. Incidentally, unemployment peaked around 14.7% in April of 2020 and is now roughly 3.6%, considered fairly low. Most experts consider 4 to 5% normal unemployment. So things may be moving in the right direction. So let's shift gears a little bit to talk about what that might mean for the 2022 elections. Policymakers are grappling with levers to relieve inflation, such as interest rates. They're grappling with immigration policy, stimulus funding. But another question is, what lever does the average American have? Well, we'd be remiss if we didn't cover potential ways that the inflation levels might impact elections this fall. Democrats' majority in Congress is razor thin. The Senate is a 50-50 split, with Vice President Kamala Harris breaking the tie, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi's control of the House rests on a quite slim margin. All 435 seats of the House of Representatives and 35 out of the 100 seats in the Senate will be contested. Additionally, 36 states will elect governors. Virginia's election will include all 11 members of the U.S. House of the Representatives. Senators Kane and Warner aren't up for re-election until 2024 and 2026. 2023 will also see all the members of Virginia's legislature up for re-election. This year's elections are also going to be the first under the newly drawn maps since the 2020 census took place. Most Americans report that the economy, cost of living, and related financial concerns as their biggest concerns and the things that they're thinking about going into the election. Biden's approval numbers have suffered, and voters have said that these important issues are the ones that are going to determine how they vote this November. Note, Biden gets particularly low marks on some of these really important issues. Independents and swing voters are particularly interesting to watch. Biden carried independent voters by 9 points in the 2020 election, but now only holds a 33% approval rating among independent voters. Predicting the future can be particularly perilous when it comes to elections. We certainly can talk about results during the previous administrations and what seems to be a correlation between broad dissatisfaction in our politics and the country continually voting against whoever is in the White House. In fact, the public has voted for change in 7 of the last 8 elections, and some would say they're likely to do so again in November. So that means every 2 years, the public votes against who they voted for 2 years earlier. While this slide has got a lot of numbers on it, what you can see is it moves in opposite directions of the person holding the White House. Swing voters, like I said, are particularly important. They also are particularly concerned about economic issues. Given Biden's low numbers in these areas, there are ominous signs for Democrats in November. For the 435 seats of the House of Representatives, and based on consensus forecasts by Sabato's Crystal Ball, the Cook Political Report, and Inside Elections, many experts are suggesting that Democrats will wind up comfortably holding about 193 seats, while Republicans are safe in about 213 seats in the House. That leaves about 29 seats as toss-ups, with the power of the House hanging in the balance. In the US Senate, there are 100 members, each serves a 6-year term, and elections are staggered. So roughly 1/3 is up for re-election every 2 years. In 2022, that means 35 seats are up for election. Many experts are forecasting Republicans will pick up enough seats to be in control of the US Senate, with the economy being a major factor why. So to wrap up, before we shift to Q&A, I want to quickly summarize a couple of things. Some goods and services and products are experiencing a higher than normal cost due to very limited supply and record high demand. A lot of the ways that we have to control or limit inflation are fairly unpopular with voters. Restarting an entire global supply chain to improve supply is not quick, and it's not easy. Prices will eventually go down. Patience is key for avoiding costly impacts, and how the economy performs over the next few months could have a measurable impact, not just in the elections in November of 2022, but also in 2023. With that, Paula, I'll turn it over to you and we can take some questions from folks.
Thank you so much, Katharine. That was really interesting, and it was a great economics and inflation kind of 101 lesson. So thank you for all of your insight and expertise. I'm going to start with a question from the chat, and we may want to pull this slide back up if you're able to do that, Eric and Katie. It comes from Jose, and he asks if the slide on the employment rate, which as I recall is in the low 60%. And those are, and that's not really employment rate, but those who could be employed, how many are employed, and whether or not that takes into account the Great Resignation that happened during the pandemic and maybe is still happening, and those who may have lost their jobs and just are no longer in the market for a job. And of course, we've also heard a lot of stories about parents struggling with daycare and potentially one of the parents deciding to stay home, at least for the time being in the short term because of the daycare challenges. So back to the question at hand, does this in fact reflect that Great Resignation and some of the job losses caused by the pandemic?
Jose, thanks for the great question. The short answer is yes, this does account for that. So this is 62% is around where is the measure in the case of this slide of the labor force participation. Other measures that indicate economic health are the unemployment rate, which is hovering around 3.6%, so below 4%. But it does include those factors that Jose mentioned. It also represents a trend that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage in media, and that is the number of baby boomers who are starting to retire in mass. We saw a lot of baby boomers retire during the pandemic, and that trend is continuing. So in short, yes, this does include those measures. It does account for those, but there's a lot of drivers, not just the Great Resignation, but maybe the Great Retirement too. And we can expect some of those trends to continue as baby boomers make up such a large percentage of the population of the workforce today.
Although, Katharine, you and I were talking before we got started, and perhaps one of the challenges for baby boomers who might be old enough now or have enough years of service to retire, if they're looking at the stock market, they may be a little leery about retiring. So we've got many, many factors going on at one time, as we always
Absolutely.
do.
Absolutely.
Another question, this one from Carolyn Frey. If inflation continues and people are not able to afford goods and services, how is that going to impact supply and demand? Will that help inflation or hurt inflation if that demand goes down because of the cost increases?
So Carolyn, great question. And I would say generally, if we sort of go back to the very simple elements of supply and demand, to the extent people can't afford the goods and services, demand will ultimately go down. Perhaps a more personalized approach to answering that question is, what about a mother who can't, or a parent, mother, father, or parent, grandparent who can't afford baby formula? There are many,
Or maybe find it.
or find it in this case, exactly. And so while there are some goods and services that are luxuries, and we can elect not to get our hair cut as often, we can elect not to purchase new clothes, but there are lots of goods and services that are seeing increasing prices that are not luxury items. And so the question then becomes, how do you handle inflation in a time when affordability and availability of those products are really necessary, food, shelter, and so forth. But great question, thank you.
And Carolyn has a follow-up, which is if companies find themselves in debt or perhaps are cutting back on production because of the cost of raw materials, and that means that they freeze employment. I've actually heard the term layoff a couple of times, some layoffs in the last few weeks, which is surprising given the labor shortage. But how would that affect inflation if the job market cools down a bit and the jobs that are available decrease? What impact would that have on inflation?
Well, one can hope that if there are layoffs that occur, that there's hiring occurring in other sectors or with similar types of talent. If we look at the job postings in many sectors, a lot of people will report that they leave job postings open for weeks and weeks and weeks, in some cases without getting a single applicant. So not only is there there's a shortage of workers, there's a shortage of people seeking employment. So I have also heard the term layoffs, but it is an interesting dynamic. In many of those cases, I think it's the shortage of raw materials that is causing companies not to be able to produce what they ordinarily would be able to, if they had ready access to the raw materials they need. And if they can't produce, then paying the bills including paying their payroll, becomes quite challenging.
We have another question, and this really has to do more not with the raw materials, but with the finished products. And that is whether or not price gouging or profiteering by companies, sort of, those who take advantage of all the current economic issues, is that increasing to the price of goods or services? So again, companies raising prices that aren't necessarily reflective of their cost to produce whatever their good or service is. And also, if we witness price gouging or we think we see it, what can a consumer do? Who monitors that?
Another great question. I would say, generally speaking, price gouging isn't what we observe during inflation necessarily. Inflation is a general rise across many sectors of the cost of goods and services, or can be observed in that way. Price gouging tends to be when, not paying $5 a gallon for gas, which seems to be, at least nationwide, the going market rate. But if somebody were to ask you to pay $10 for a gallon of gas, that would clearly potentially be price gouging. In terms of what we can do as consumers about it, the Federal Trade Commission has the authority to actually seek civil penalties during a declared emergency. Various states empower offices, such as here in Virginia, the Office of the Attorney General, with enforcing an anti-price gouging law. Today, complaints can be reported through a hotline that's monitored by the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Office. Sometimes it can be harder to prove, again, in times where all prices are going up versus somebody charging an extraordinarily high price for a good or service that's in short supply sort of nationwide.
Thank you. And speaking of supply and demand, how can the general public be made to understand that sometimes temporary fluctuations in prices or supply don't necessarily mean that they should be hoarding or emptying the shelves of something as critical as baby formula or toilet paper? We all have memories of being limited to the number of certain items that we could purchase. So are there any messages that government officials or economists can send out to consumers to help avoid that hoarding?
So I think one important entity we haven't talked about is the media, and what's the role of the media in that as well? Because in the early days of the pandemic, there weren't actual shortages on a broad scale for things like paper goods, toilet paper, paper towels, but it got covered in the media, and you saw video and pictures of bare store shelves. So when anybody went to the store, logically, if they thought they wouldn't be able to get paper towels next week, instead of buying one roll of paper towels or two, they bought 5 or 6 or 10 or however many they could. So our buying behavior can also contribute to the problem, as you mentioned. Simply said, don't contribute to the short supplies by buying more than you need. But I'll go back to the baby formula example. Tell that to the parent who hasn't been able to find baby formula in weeks and suddenly finds 3 cans on the shelf. Do they leave 2 cans there for somebody else, or do they buy the 3 cans not knowing that whether they're going to be able to find it the next time they go back to the store? So hoarding can certainly delay a return to normal in terms of the supply chain. But we saw some stores start to regulate that by limiting numbers of purchases of items that were in short supply. So there was a little bit of self-regulation that occurred in that as well.
Great, thank you for that insight. It is a dilemma indeed, when it appears that things are going to be in short supply. We've got a question from Dr. Jay Albanese, and he says it's troubling that A, there's relatively little that policymakers can do to address inflation, and B, what can be done is unpopular, as you outlined. And so what does this say for the future, where legislators increasingly maybe feel that they should only be doing what is popular rather than what is needed for the economy?
Dr. Albanese, it's a great question. And I think that's the question that legislators are grappling with, right? What do we do in terms of how do we vote on these various stimulus packages? And if the Fed officials, what do we do related to interest rates? Rising interest rates aren't necessarily popular, but how do you take money out of the mix and limit money supply? So hopefully that affects, again, laws of supply and demand. And policymakers have to grapple with that, not just on these levers, but so many other things they have to vote on that may be somewhat unpopular with voters or constituents. And so if somebody doesn't, for example, vote for gas tax relief, what does that mean to them in the upcoming election? They don't necessarily have the opportunity to all those constituents to explain why behind the vote if they don't support cutting gas prices. But an opponent can just say, hey, somebody didn't support a gas price decrease for you, the consumers. I'm out to help you. So it certainly is something that policymakers have to grapple with. I'm glad I'm not one of them, because it certainly is a tough choice they have to make.
Absolutely. Switching gears a little bit, going back to employment, Peter asks, how do companies utilizing virtual work schedules during the height of the pandemic plan to respond to a looming recession? And would these companies potentially return to full virtual work again? I know there's been some debate with higher gas prices and all the money that everyone who was able to work virtually was able to save from gas and parking and all the other things that come into a daily commute. So any thoughts, Katharine, about companies being able to potentially help ease a little bit of the burden for their workers with remote work?
So Pierre, that's a great question. Thanks, Paula, for sharing that. So I do think that what we're seeing in a couple of different areas is that companies are considering a couple of things. They're considering the economics, they're considering feasibility, but they're also considering company culture. So when it comes to feasibility, not all companies can go virtual. And frankly, not all workers can work virtually. One of the things that the COVID pandemic has heightened our awareness about is broadband access. Not everyone has access to broadband and can conduct work virtually or via Zoom or another virtual platform on a day-to-day basis. So I guess the question becomes, can a company go virtual? If they do go virtual, then what's the impact on culture? How do you train people? How do you have collegial relationships, collaboration? And can your teams work effectively if they're not present in person? It does seem like we're seeing a trend of companies going back with a hybrid work schedule. So hopefully that does provide some of the relief that you mentioned, Paula, things like gas price relief and so on for some workers. Some companies have said they plan to stay entirely virtual. We'll see how it plays out over the longer term. But one of the things we're also seeing in this job market is that employers have to be flexible, because if they're losing people to companies that tend to be more flexible than they are, maybe they have to rethink their approach.
Great insight. Dr. Harper Anderson has a question, and that is whether or not you think that the potential recession will affect equity and inclusion initiatives in the labor market and across the economy, given the increased attention to this issue in recent years. So will some of that work be impacted by the current economic challenges?
So Dr. Harper Anderson, I think it's a great question. And maybe I'll start by talking about the immigrant workforce, because certainly some of the policies and some of the limitations related to welcoming immigrants into the country as part of the workforce were absolutely certainly affected by COVID and have not fully rebounded. So in that respect, I think the answer to your question is yes, I think it has had an effect. I do think, though, that many companies, many organizations, public officials, and others are are incredibly supportive of diversity and inclusion and equity related efforts. And those commitments transcend what many would consider temporary economic cycles.
Great. It's an important item to watch in terms of getting back to full employment. A question from Alejandro. Are you able to provide, Katharine, any personal opinion on potential recession and or a housing burst? Are we in a bubble again? And why are some people saying that we may have that? I know, just for fun, I tend to watch real estate and real estate prices, and I have gotten more notices from Zillow that say price reduction just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And I was commenting to my husband, I wonder if that's the beginning of a trend. Very anecdotal information, but I hadn't seen price reduction on a listing in a long time. So Alejandro wants to know, do you think there might be a housing bubble burst?
So Alejandro, I think I probably would have answered your question a little differently just a couple weeks ago, but this summer I'm actually taking a class in research methods. So I'm going to apply what I've learned in just the couple weeks that I've been in that class. And I'll say this, if you look at the past and we look at the time series data, it would lead us to believe that the peak we're experiencing is unsustainable. The question is, how far does it correct and when? And I think that's what a lot of experts are honing in on, because everyone wants to try to predict the future in that sense. I won't claim that I can. I don't have a crystal ball, but when I look at just sort of the normal rhythms of the economy, although they don't exactly mirror each other, peaks are at different levels, valleys are at different levels. Sometimes they take different periods of time to play out. It does seem like we are in store for a correction, in my opinion. The question really becomes for folks like the Fed, can we make sure that any levers that are utilized don't inadvertently send us too far in the opposite direction? Many would argue that when there's a change, for example, in interest rates, that it might take 12 or more months for that change to be known. And so if we keep seeing change after change after change after change without letting the full period of time play out, we may see a correction that goes too far in the other way, in the other direction. So great question, Alejandro. Thank you.
Although it seems to continue to be a good time if you're selling, but a tough time if you're purchasing a house. Trey
Absolutely
asks, as inflation rises, we see a trend of unemployment falling. You showed us that in your wonderful charts. So as the Fed does what it can to cool things off by raising interest rates to control inflation, are we in store for some more unemployment? I know we talked briefly about some layoffs that we're maybe seeing, but at one point, does the increase in the cost of money start to cause unemployment to go up?
So Trey, great question. I think it really speaks to the balance we've talked about so far, right? And that is, how can you pull back money out of the economy so some of those inflationary measures start to move in the other direction without going too far in the opposite direction? So again, just as recently as early 2020, we saw unemployment levels in the 14, almost 15% record high levels. And they quickly dropped over a relatively short period of time to unemployment below 4%. And so again, most economists would tell you that they consider around 5% to be relatively normal. But try telling that to somebody who's looking for employment, or looking to be gainfully employed and not underemployed as well. So I do think that we'll see more unemployment. The question is, can we avoid recessionary levels of unemployment as the correction occurs?
So if you had an opportunity to read the Richmond Times-Dispatch this morning, to those who are tuned in, and I know there are people from across the country, the Richmond Fed president, Tom Barkin, actually was speaking pretty optimistically and saying he believes that the economy is relatively healthy. And he thinks that the pretty dramatic increase by 0.75% for the interest rates last week and whatever else might be planned later in the summer actually is going to do the trick to return the economy back to normal, and that we will be able to avoid having a recession. So I know you've talked a couple of times, Katharine, about, we have to wait and see. It's not an automatic. It takes some time to see what kind of impact that has. But how long do we have to wait? When are we going to know if the impact from last week's decision to raise rates is starting to cool things down? And what should we be looking for in terms of knowing, are the Fed's actions working?
So great question. There's not any one indicator that's important. And I think I would certainly yield to Mr. Barkin as a subject matter expert in this area and trust his knowledge and his assessment that he's starting to see positive signs. And the Fed's been incredibly disciplined in terms of not making huge step changes. They tend to move gradually for that very reason, to give it time to play out before making a drastic change or an additional change in order to help avoid things going into recessionary levels. The question again is, can we have a correction without having an overcorrection? So we'll look at things like CPI. We'll look at all those elements that indicate both supply and demand, not just money supply, but supply of goods and services. How many people are employed? How many people are looking for jobs? What are housing prices doing? We're going to start to see it at the pump. And we've talked a lot about the COVID pandemic, but we can't forget the Ukraine-Russia war as well. It's putting a real pressure on things like cooking oils and grains globally. So the question then may shift to, are there certain sectors in which we may see goods and services that are still relatively high while others normalize? They won't necessarily all move in the same direction at exactly the same time.
I do think we've all gotten a little bit of a lesson from the Russian-Ukraine war about how important that relatively small country of Ukraine is in the world's supply, as you said, of grains and other food products, as well as oil and gas. And we're not sure when that is going to come to an end. It seems to be going on much longer than many people thought. So that is clearly one of the unknowns in the economy. We've got a different question from Daniel, and that is the cost of higher education and students having to potentially borrow more money as tuition goes up and fees go up, and now interest rates are going up too. And so he is asking if there are any trends in enrollment from past hard times that may hint at future enrollment trends. I know that's not really your expertise, Katharine, but maybe since you are currently a student pursuing your PhD, what are you hearing, even anecdotally, from your fellow students?
So I can tell you anecdotally, this topic actually comes up quite a bit during our lively discussions in class and among those of us who are talking about various policies. And I can actually think about this not only from my own perspective, but I'm actually the mother of a rising college sophomore, second year student as well. So I'm a parent that certainly understands those increases, but again, I don't like them. I wish they weren't there, but as we see the costs of everything around us going up, it's hard to imagine that the cost of education won't, because we know everything that the universities and colleges, trade schools, and institutes of higher education, everything that they're having to purchase, whether it's paper or pens or anything along those lines, building construction materials, for example, it's costing them more money too. And so they at some point either have to cut services in order to maintain flat levels of tuition, or have to make other really hard decisions. And I think that I don't want to speak for any of the universities in particular, but Most companies, most institutes of higher education, the last thing they want to do is raise costs for students. So they're mindful of the things that Daniel's mentioned, and they certainly are relevant to all of us who either have students or ourselves are students.
Great, and my apologies. It's Danielda, beautiful name. I was only seeing the first couple of letters of your name. So thank you for that great question. I know at times when unemployment is high, often more people go back to increase their education and will enroll in higher education because the employment isn't so good. But we really don't have that right now. It's really an interesting time where some of the traditional factors are at opposite ends. So very hard to predict, in fact.
Well, and some are lagging indicators and some are leading indicators. So some
Right.
just take a little while longer to make their way to the various statistics that we're looking at. Dr. Harper Anderson reports that PhD student applications are up. So
All right. Well, that's good.
We're moving in the right
Thank you.
direction.
Yeah, I think most higher ed folks, including here at VCU, are working to keep things steady, not seeing a huge increase, but we do tend to see that increase in graduate students, and so that's great. It's good to know that the PhD program here at the Wilder School is certainly thriving. All right, another question about, will we get to all the questions? Well, we're trying to get through as many as we can. We do have a lot of questions that were submitted in advance, and we thank you for all of those. We've got about 5 minutes left. We have talked, Katharine, a good bit about supply and demand. And, we want different things during different seasons. One of the things that I think is interesting to watch is the amount of travel and all of the issues that are going on with airlines as people feel comfortable again to travel, summer being a big travel season. Obviously, then when we get into the holidays, that is as well. How do those kinds of goods and services that, as you described earlier, are maybe a little more luxury and not as essential, like travel, like hotels, like restaurants, how does that play into whether or not our current inflation is going to go into a recession?
Perhaps more so than indicating when we might move into recession, those tend to be some of the first things that families making tough choices during recessionary times cut out. So it actually could be something that if we are in a recessionary period, becomes an indicator of the lack of financial health at the time. In this case, I think what we're seeing in terms of canceled flights doesn't have anything to do with demand. Many of the flights that are canceled are not empty flights. They're not being canceled for lack of want on the part of passengers. It goes back to a couple things, one of them being workforce shortages. So many airlines have had to cancel flights because of crew or pilot shortages, or at least not being able to meet the demands based on the number of flights that have been relatively booked. So if we enter a recessionary period, however, those are the demands for that kind of discretionary expenditure is one that we may see folks cut back on as an early indicator.
Great. Well, we are just about out of time. Any final thoughts? Are you more with the Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, who says there have been storm clouds hanging over the economy and now it's a hurricane, or our own Richmond Fed president, who says he thinks that the economy is relatively healthy?
I would say I'm an eternal optimist, so I want to believe that everything's heading in the right direction for everyone sooner rather than later. Now, that might be a little pie in the sky, but I like to believe that that's the direction where we're headed, not just from an economic perspective, but in so many other ways too. But just closing thoughts, Paula, I wanted to thank you and the organizers, and I really need to thank my colleague Eric Bakeman, who's been a huge help to me in this presentation, our colleague Doug for his contributions, and others who've helped get us ready for today.
Great. And we did have one final question. I know we're at like the last minute, and really it's about the phenomenon that we now have these sites like LinkedIn and Indeed as a way for people to look for work. And I'm looking for the question. And that is, does that make it, I guess, more difficult for job seekers, or is that a great tool now for companies looking for employees?
I would say, generally speaking, there's a lot of great tools. I'm not as familiar about maybe one tool versus another, but one thing that both job seekers and employers have to do is cut through the noise. And sometimes that's the hardest thing, is to make sure that we have an opportunity to match up those folks with the skill sets that are needed with the jobs that can fully employ them based on their abilities, their training, their education, and their full potential. So again, I think things are moving in the right direction, and many of those tools can be great resources for both employers and employees. But thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate the invitation to join you today.
And thank you. It's really been a great discussion. We have another wonderful Lunch and Learn planned for July. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to give us a preview on that. Thank you for having me moderate today, Stephen.
Thanks, Paula. And thank you, Catherine, and to our communications team working hard in the background. Thank you to all of our audience who submitted some really great questions and really elevated what is already a great conversation about real world topics. As you can see in the chat, we've listed some of those emails and contacts that I mentioned earlier, as well as our Wilder School in Action magazine. And you can learn more about the new Wilder School rankings as well. Next month, we'll be discussing the resurgence of rural America with Basil Gooden, Director of State Operations, on July 20th at 12 p.m. We hope you'll join. We really look forward to engaging in another great conversation as a part of this great series that we host here at the Wilder School. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your day and great rest of your week as well.